Hello and how are you doing? It's me, it's Deep in the Reads, and I'm here with another book. The book in this case is Rebellion, The History of England from James I to the Glorious Revolution by Peter Ackroyd. Peter Ackroyd is a guy who's been writing since the 70s, doing historical fiction and pop history books like this one. He focuses, of course, on the history of England most of the time, and a while ago he wrote a 6-book series spanning from England's prehistoric beginnings all the way until now. Rebellion is the 3rd book in that series, and I've been wanting to read a history book on England for a long time now, especially since I visited London several years back. And then after I read A Distant Mirror last year, I knew I wanted more, so I just wasn't sure where to start. So then I found a video on YouTube by Historia Civilis about the time that England put their own king on trial, sentenced him to death, and tried to form their own republic. And I'm like, I think this is the period I want to read about. So fortunately, Peter Ackroyd's England series can be started anywhere you want. So I jumped right into the middle of the series, and I'm so glad I did because I had a lot of fun with this. As the subtitle of this book suggests, it starts off right away with James I, who is the first Stuart King of England, and then you pretty much go through the entire 1600s, ending with the final Stuart King of England at the Glorious Revolution. The book also covers the rise of Oliver Cromwell, the Civil Wars, various disasters that befall England, like some plagues and the Great Fire of London, as well as some stuff on the 30 Years' War. You can tell right when you start that this is a pop history, too. There's no prologue, there's no setup, it's just being thrown straight into the action like it's a novel. Then, within 50 pages, you've got Catholic terrorists digging tunnels to blow up Parliament. You've got a duke's wife scheming to take his best friend out of power, a king so in debt that he can't get a line of credit, and all of these people jostling to insert people into the king's inner circle to sway him in one way or the other. It's pretty crazy. Ackroyd writes with a great sense of narrative flow and a brisk pace. But at the same time, I found myself sometimes being overwhelmed by the information and all the names, so I found myself having to go back and reread paragraphs quite often as I went through this book. Ackroyd, though, he doesn't let you just blow in the wind. He's aware that this is a difficult period, so he'll put in little reminders every once in a while to clue you in on why an event was significant or who a certain person is, so that's really appreciated for someone like me. So the main narrative in this history is that there are 2 main sources of conflict in England during this period. There's the political and there's the religious. So on the religious side, England is a Protestant country, but it has a lot of Catholics in it. And this is a time when the tensions between these 2 denominations were huge. So there's a lot of cracking down on religious liberties, especially on Catholics, and while that's happening, there's also this tension of all these people in Parliament wanting a more democratic country and the king wanting a more monarchical country, so the Parliament and the king are often like butting heads, especially when money is concerned, because Parliament's one piece of leverage over the king is that they hold the purse strings of the country. So the king sort of circumvents that and starts getting money elsewhere and decides to dismiss Parliament for over a decade because he's like, I got my money, I don't need you guys, now we're in an autocracy. So all of this and the religious tensions and everything else, like international politics, all come to a head in a very predictable way. You can see what's coming a mile down the road, and you see how all of these people in power are just like blissfully careening towards disaster, but decide to not really pull out of the tailspin. It's kind of like modern day. So like you'd expect in a book like this, tensions just mount and mount until things come to a head when Charles I cracks down on the Scottish Presbyterians and a rebellion begins when a woman throws a chair at one of his religious ministers in a church. So Charles sends a bunch of people to put down the rebellion, and when the Scots eventually bring them to the negotiating table, Parliament seizes the upper hand and ends up getting more power than they've had before. And then they fight. And there's a lot of fighting. Overall, the book was a really great ride. It has a lot of really colorful anecdotes to familiarize yourself with the period. It really gets into characters' heads and talks about their motivations. This book is great at keeping things moving and reading almost like a novel. And while that's good in some ways, it's kind of a drawback in others. The main one being that Ackroyd sometimes just doesn't give you a detailed explanation about things that are really important to what's going on. So for example, he doesn't really take the time to explain the tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants. He also doesn't take the time to explain just the hierarchy of government in 17th century England. And while I was able to infer a fair bit, I still wish that he'd just gone into frank, concise detail on these subjects. It might be that one of the later books, or the earlier books in the series, explained a bit better, or it might just be that he's writing for an English audience that would have learned all this stuff in school. But, you know, I went into this expecting it to be a good introductory text to this period, and while it definitely was in some ways, like with the figures and the events and stuff like that, in some ways it kind of dropped the ball as an introductory book. I also found Ackroyd's prioritizing to be a little bit odd at times. So every once in a while in this book you get a shorter intermission chapter which sort of cuts away from the narrative action to talk about the culture, like some scientific advancements that are happening, or he talks about literature a lot. So some of those chapters are really great at giving you insight into how people were feeling and what they were thinking. But then other chapters that are like this just feel like he's trying to round up the information he couldn't use elsewhere because he doesn't want it to go to waste, and just sort of shoehorning it in as these sort of free-floating chapters. And I wish he had used this space to instead talk about filling in the gaps that I mentioned earlier. I feel like the stuff he wanted to say about literature from the time period could have been integrated into the other chapters in a smoother way. Another aspect of this book that's a little bit of a double-edged sword because of the pop history style are the sections on war. So in most history books that I've read, when it comes to the war parts, it gets completely bogged down in details and you almost lose track of the big picture stuff. But what Rebellion does really great is keep the important things in plain view, so you're not getting lost, you know what's going on, and that's despite the fact that the Civil Wars are just inherently very confusing. There's constant side switching and different alliances that are shifting depending on what point in the war you're at. So the book does great at navigating all of that. The drawback, though, with these war sections is that Ackroyd doesn't do the best job at conveying the scale of the devastation here. So, in my opinion, the war chapters would have been a great place to integrate some of the literature from the time and maybe use a farmer's diary or a soldier's diary to really impress upon you just how much damage was being done and how horrible it was to live through all this stuff. With all of my mixed messages about this book, you're probably wondering where I land on it overall. I don't want to give the impression, though, that the detractors I mentioned are a huge deal, because they're really not. This is a pop history book, and a lot of the issues I brought up are just the trade-off you get when you decide to go for a very introductory, accessible pop history. This book has a lot of strengths, which are mainly to do with its readability. It's really engaging. Ackroyd does a great job of simplifying a very complex period. Overall, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. While I didn't get everything I wanted out of it, and I certainly wish it had taught me a little bit more in detail, it still left me very informed about what characterized the century, the major events, the major figures, and most importantly, it made me curious enough that I want to read more about the period, which is exactly what I plan on doing later this year because there's a couple books set during the time that I want to read. First up is this murder mystery called An Instance of the Finger Post, which I plan on reading next. And then later in the year, I want to read Leviathan, the philosophy book that was written during the time. So I may be reviewing one or both of these later this year, along with a bunch of other random books that I think are worth talking about. So if you care about that at all, maybe consider subscribing. If you've read any books from this period or whatever, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think if you've read this or anything else like it. And that's all for now, so I'm gonna head out now. Have fun with whatever you're reading. Goodbye.